Nobody in Chang'an in the early Han court would have described it this way. Not because it was wrong, but because the mental map didn't exist yet. A frontier without a clear end. A northern horizon that wasn't empty, just unclassified. To the west of China, before Roman coins ever reached Central Asia in meaningful volume, there was already a political machine operating across the steppe, the Xiongnu Confederation. Not an empire in the Roman sense, not a dynasty in the Han sense either. Something looser, more adaptive, built for movement, tribute extraction, and control of routes rather than cities. And here's the uncomfortable part. This system was already shaping the flow of goods that would later be labeled Silk Road trade, before Rome and Han China had any meaningful direct awareness of each other's existence. We tend to imagine ancient civilizations as isolated nodes that suddenly connect. The archaeological record doesn't really support that simplicity. What it shows instead is layered intermediaries, groups that didn't just pass goods along, but taxed them, redirected them, and sometimes blocked them entirely depending on seasonal politics. The Xiongnu sat in that position relative to Han China in the 2nd century BCE. Chinese historical records, especially the Shiji of Sima Qian, describe them less like a distant foreign state and more like a persistent structural pressure, something closer to a shifting border economy than a neighboring country. At the same time, far to the west, Rome was still transitioning from republic to empire. It had no confirmed diplomatic contact with Han China, no embassies, no shared strategic language. Yet Roman luxury demand, silk in particular, was already beginning to ripple eastward through Parthian intermediaries in Central Asia. And here is the key mechanism most simplified histories miss. No single empire controlled the entire route. Control was fragmented into segments, each dominated by different powers, and the steppe confederations were often the ones stitching those fragments together through coercion and negotiated passage. Think of it less like a road and more like a chain of toll booths stretched across thousands of kilometers, where the toll collectors are mobile and armed. One of those collectors, the Xiongnu, didn't just sit in the middle. They actively shaped what moved, what stopped, and what became valuable enough to be worth moving in the first place. There's a tendency in modern narratives to treat them as peripheral actors to real civilizations like Rome or Han China. But that framing collapses once you look at logistics instead of ideology. If you control the corridor, you control the rhythm of exchange. Even if you never write a philosophy, you still shape the system. We'll come back to how that control actually broke apart and why both Rome and China eventually had to redesign their entire frontier strategy around a geography they never fully controlled. And there's a detail buried in Chinese envoy records that doesn't quite fit the clean story of separation. References to Western lands that are described with second-hand precision, as if the system was already feeding information long before direct contact was possible. Opinion. The Silk Road as a bridge between two known worlds is backwards. It looks more like two blind empires feeling their way toward a system already partially built between them by others. Doubt. Whether we are overestimating the coherence of groups like the Xiongnu by applying later imperial logic onto something that may have been far more fractured and opportunistic than stable. Prediction. If we reconstruct Eurasian connectivity properly, the steppe confederations stop looking like background noise and start looking like the operating system the early global economy accidentally ran on. The surprising part about the Xiongnu isn't that they existed north of China. That part is expected. Every agrarian empire had a frontier. The uncomfortable part is how systematically they converted geography into leverage without building anything that looks like an empire. Around 200 BCE, after the collapse of the Qin and the consolidation of the Han under Emperor Gaozu, Chinese court records begin describing something that reads less like warfare and more like administrative friction. Border raids, yes, but also negotiated tribute, marriage alliances, exchange of envoys who sometimes never returned. This is where the mechanism matters more than the label. The Xiongnu, under leaders like Modu Chanyu, weren't just raiding for goods. They were managing a political economy of motion. Herds moved seasonally, camps relocated. Pressure was applied not to hold land, but to control access through it. If Han China wanted peace on its northern frontier, it paid in silk, grain, and metal, not as symbolic tribute, but as predictable fiscal transfer. That matters because predictability is the foundation of economic systems. And once that predictability exists, intermediaries can build entire downstream networks on it. To the west, in the region that would later become Sogdiana and Bactria, merchants were already operating in long-distance caravan chains. These weren't state-run systems. They were private, fragmented, and often multilingual. Goods moved through layers of brokers, each taking a cut, each dependent on someone further upstream who controlled passage. The Xiongnu inserted themselves into that chain not as producers or consumers, but as gatekeepers of timing. When a caravan left the Tarim Basin, it did so under conditions that had already been priced by steppe politics. Safe passage wasn't guaranteed by law. It was guaranteed by negotiated absence of interference. That distinction is easy to miss, but it changes everything. Because once you control whether movement is allowed or delayed, you control scarcity. And scarcity is what turns silk into a currency in Rome, rather than just a textile in China. There is a Roman reference worth pausing on here. By the late Republic and early Imperial period, writers like Pliny the Elder describe silk as something that arrives through Ceres, a vague Eastern people. Not China as a state, not a mapped empire, just a source layer beyond known geography. That vagueness is important. It tells us Rome was not interacting with China directly, but with a supply chain so long and segmented that the origin point had already become abstract. We often imagine trade routes as lines connecting two endpoints. What actually existed was a stack of controlled fragments. The Xiongnu controlled one of the most critical fragments because they controlled adjacency, the pressure zone where Chinese agricultural wealth met steppe mobility. There's a detail in Han military correspondence that is easy to overlook. Repeated references to He-Qin policies, marriage alliances, and tribute payments designed to stabilize the frontier. On paper, it looks diplomatic. Structurally, it functioned like a recurring payment to prevent disruption of trade and border settlement. That is not diplomacy in the modern sense. It is risk pricing. And here is where the system becomes almost self-reinforcing. The more valuable silk became in Western markets, the more incentive there was for intermediaries to keep routes unstable enough to justify their role, but stable enough to keep goods moving. That balance is fragile. And it does not require a central planner. It emerges from incentives alone. We'll come back to what happens when Han China eventually decides that paying for stability is more expensive than removing the source of instability entirely, and why that decision collapses the old steppe configuration. Opinion. The Xiongnu were not a missing empire in the Roman sense. They were closer to a distributed control system over Eurasian logistics, where power came from interruption rather than production. Doubt. Whether the surviving Chinese records overemphasize coherence in Xiongnu leadership structures because sedentary states naturally interpret mobility as hierarchy. Prediction. Once we map ancient Eurasian trade as a network of controlled choke points rather than continuous roads, the Silk Road stops being a route and starts looking like a negotiated instability zone that every empire had to learn to survive, not own. Dot. The Han didn't defeat the Xiongnu in a single decisive moment. There is no clean fall of an empire scene here. What happened instead is slower, more administrative, and far more consequential than most battlefield narratives suggest. By the 1st century BCE, under Emperor Wu of Han, China shifts strategy. Instead of treating the northern frontier as a cost center managed through tribute and marriage alliances, the state begins a sustained military and logistical push into the steppe. Campaigns led by generals like Wei Qing and Huo Qubing don't just target Xiongnu forces, they target their ability to coordinate. That distinction matters, because coordination in a mobile confederation is everything. The Xiongnu system was not built on fixed cities or infrastructure that could be captured. It depended on seasonal convergence points, pasture access, and the ability to impose pressure across dispersed groups. When Han forces pushed deeper into the Ordos region and beyond the Gobi, they weren't occupying territory in the Roman sense. They were disrupting timing. And once timing breaks, authority becomes expensive to maintain. At the same time, something less visible begins to shift farther west. The Parthian Empire, sitting between Rome and Central Asia, starts tightening its control over intermediary trade nodes. Not because they suddenly become expansionist, but because the fragmentation to their east is becoming harder to predict. This is where the Silk Road begins to change character. Before this period, the Xiongnu and other steppe groups acted as a kind of regulatory buffer. They could block, reroute, or accelerate movement depending on political incentives. But they also maintained a kind of rough continuity across the steppe corridor. They were unpredictable, but not absent. As Han pressure increases, that buffer begins to fracture. Some Xiongnu groups splinter westward. Others submit and are absorbed into Han frontier systems. A portion relocates into Central Asia, where they begin to interact directly with Sogdian merchant networks in ways that were previously filtered through steppe mediation. The result is not stabilization, it is volatility. Trade doesn't become freer, it becomes more segmented, and segmentation increases transaction costs. Roman records from the early imperial period continue to describe silk as arriving through intermediaries. But now the chain becomes longer and more politically diverse. The Seres are still not clearly identified as a unified China. Instead, they remain a distant source obscured by multiple layers of control: Parthian, Sogdian, steppe remnants, and local caravan authorities. There is an irony here that Chinese sources hint at indirectly. As Han military success pushes the Xiongnu out of their dominant position, China gains more direct control over its own frontier zones, but loses the stable intermediary that had, unintentionally, regulated trans-Eurasian exchange. In other words, the empire wins its border war and inherits a more complicated world. A line in the Book of Han describes envoys reaching further west than before, reporting unfamiliar polities and goods. These accounts are often treated as early globalization moments, but structurally, they are more like reconnaissance reports from a system that has lost its buffer layer and is now touching other systems without insulation. There is a quiet example buried in the archaeology of the Tarim Basin: shifts in burial goods and textile styles that suggest overlapping influence zones rather than clean cultural replacement. No single power replaces the Xiongnu layer. Multiple smaller systems begin to overlap in its absence. That is the key transition point. The Silk Road does not begin as a road. It becomes one only after the middle collapses and is replaced by a patchwork of weaker, competing intermediaries. We'll come back to Rome in the final section, because at this point, Rome is still only a consumer at the edge of this system, not a participant in its architecture. And that imbalance shapes how both ends misunderstand what they are actually connected to. Opinion. The Han victory over the Xiongnu is often framed as strategic consolidation, but in logistical terms, it looks more like the removal of a stabilizing layer that the system had quietly depended on. Doubt. Whether we are misreading Xiongnu collapse as disappearance, when in reality it may be redistribution into multiple successor networks across Central Asia. Prediction. The moment we stop treating empires as endpoints and start treating them as pressure sources inside larger continental systems, the entire early history of Eurasian trade stops making sense as bilateral exchange and starts looking like cascading reconfiguration. Rome never meets China. Not once. Not in diplomacy, not in direct trade, not in anything that would qualify as mutual recognition between states. And yet Roman authors are writing about silk. Han records are mentioning distant western lands. Both sides are aware of something beyond their horizon. Neither side has a clear map of what that something is. That gap is where the entire illusion of a single Silk Road lives. By the time of Augustus and later the early imperial period, Roman demand for silk is well documented. Seneca the Younger complains about it in moral terms, calling it excessive, transparent, un-Roman. Pliny the Elder estimates vast sums of gold leaving the empire for Eastern luxuries. These are not isolated remarks. They reflect a structural drain that Roman elites could observe but not trace. What they cannot see is the chain behind it. Between Rome and Han China, there is no corridor. There is a sequence of segmented systems, Parthian-controlled Western nodes, Sogdian merchant networks operating out of oasis cities like Samarkand, remnants of steppe confederations displaced after Xiongnu fragmentation, and local intermediaries in the Tarim Basin managing access to passes and desert routes. Each layer sees only the next layer over. No one sees the whole system. And that is why both empires misread what they are connected to. Han envoys reaching the western regions describe unfamiliar political structures and goods, but their reports are filtered through multiple translations: linguistic, cultural, and logistical. By the time something reaches Chang'an, it is already a compressed interpretation of a fragmented chain. Rome experiences the same distortion in reverse. Ceres is not China. It is a category label applied to whatever distant source consistently produces silk through intermediaries. The Roman imagination fills in the rest. There is a critical point here that changes how we should understand ancient globalization. What looks like a bilateral trade relationship is actually a many-to-many system where endpoints are blind to structure. The real actors are not Rome and China. They are the intermediary nodes that control translation, passage, and timing. After the weakening of Xiongnu dominance, those intermediary nodes multiply. Sogdian merchants become more prominent in textual and archaeological records. Parthian political control over Mesopotamian and Iranian corridors tightens. Smaller, steppe-derived groups settle or fragment into new roles as escorts, bandits, or local gatekeepers. Trade volume doesn't simply increase or decrease. It changes texture. More stops, more pricing layers, more political friction embedded inside movement itself. A Roman merchant in Antioch doesn't experience China. He experiences cost fluctuations tied to caravan security in regions he cannot name. A Han official in Dunhuang doesn't experience Rome. He experiences goods filtered through requests that arrive already transformed by multiple bargaining systems. This is where the conceptual error in modern storytelling happens. We draw a line from China to Rome and call it a road. But the system behaves more like a relay with no central coordination, where each participant is optimizing locally, not globally. There is a small but telling detail in later Chinese accounts. Descriptions of Western goods sometimes include errors that make sense only if information has passed through several independent reinterpretations. Not corruption of data in a modern sense, but sequential adaptation, each layer reshaping the message to fit its own constraints. By the time something reaches Rome or Chang'an, it is not information about a distant empire. It is information about the network itself, disguised as geography. We'll close this by returning to the original assumption that Rome and China were two great poles of an ancient connected world. That framing is tidy. It is also structurally misleading. Opinion. The real story is not contact between empires, but the emergence of intermediary systems that had enough autonomy to define what each empire believed about the other. Doubt. Whether we can ever fully reconstruct these networks without overfitting modern economic logic onto systems that were simultaneously political, pastoral, and opportunistic in ways we still don't model well. Prediction. Once ancient Eurasia is mapped as a stack of interacting control zones rather than a single trade route, Rome and China will look less like endpoints of history and more like two observers inside a system neither of them designed and neither fully understood.